take a few minutes to expand on the purpose of podchurch. I'll begin by making a really bold statement. If we're going to experience the transforming presence of Jesus Christ in every community throughout Australia, it will take devoted followers of Christ who have a pioneering spirit. It will take an outreaching people who preach the gospel in word and lifestyle. And it will take disciples who are making disciples, who have that unselfish goal of equipping and releasing to multiply themselves and to multiply their churches. Now that's a big statement, isn't it? And I want to unpack it now. Well, why? Because that is the primary purpose of podchurch. Let me explain what's in the DNA of podchurch. It's all about pioneering, outreaching, and disciple making. And you think, well, isn't that what every Christian church is about? Well, I hope so, and it should be, but the difference is that podchurch is about highlighting these. We're highlighting these as our key purposes, the very things that will define who we are and what we do. So let's break it down a little bit. Firstly, pioneering. That's the P in pod. Podchurch will become an expanding network of churches. Most of them will begin as microsite churches, for example, like a house church, and that from when they launch to however large one would grow, that they would have multiplication in the DNA of that church. A pod church is born to multiply. They have that pioneering spirit within them. They grow disciples that make disciples, and as the church becomes mature enough, it will multiply itself into a new pod church. We at pod church, we know that some of our microsite churches, they will grow and become large community churches. But we will also celebrate the fact that some will stay as microsite churches, many meeting in homes. Each pod church will be different. But here's what will be the same. It's what's in the DNA. Each pod church has multiplication in its DNA. It has that pioneer spirit. Now that's the P in pod. But what about the O? Well, that's for outreaching. Podchurch is a gathering of believers who are passionate about outreach. The goal is that every believer will be equipped to preach the gospel in word and in their lifestyles for spiritual seekers to respond to the good news and be welcomed into the family. We long to see unbelievers begin their faith journey and become devoted disciples of Christ. A podchurch is all about creating and growing an evangelistic culture where it's a normal occurrence, even though it's extraordinary. It's normal to see people genuinely surrender to Christ as their Lord. And we all celebrate every time that happens, and especially when we see the fruit of transformed lives. That's the O in pod. Now that leads me to the D in pod. We are about disciple making. Podchurch members are devoted to making disciples that make disciples. Disciple making is what Jesus commissioned us to do. So we ask, what does a disciple look like? Well, disciples are people who have received and extend the grace of God. People who are growing in their walk with God. People who are committed to serving and giving into the church of God. And people who are connecting deeply to other people of God. This is really the goal of our ministry. It's what we're all about. Okay, so that's what pod is all about. That's our purpose. Pioneering, outreaching, and disciple making. Now, imagine if a network of pod churches began spreading throughout our nation, where the key focus was not on just growing bigger through addition, but where the focus is on exponential multiplication until the presence of Christ would be in every community throughout our nation. When focusing on growth through addition, it's more about just adding more people to one church. And that's great. But in a pod, the focus is on multiplication, which is about exponential growth. And that comes not just by gathering people in and adding to what we already have now, but it comes by equipping them and releasing them and sending people out for the purpose of multiplying into new pods, that then they would multiply and expand across the nation. We at Podchurch believe it's time for a reset of our purpose in the church. So let's not forget what we're all about. We are about pioneering, we are about outreaching, and we are about disciple making. Amen.